When I was 30, I bought my younger cousin Daniel a high-end gaming PC for his 17th birthday. At the time, he was completely obsessed with gaming. He would spend hours talking about frame rates, game mechanics, and the latest releases. I had some extra money back then, so I figured it would be a cool gift. Something meaningful. The reaction from my family was overwhelmingly positive. My parents, aunts, uncles, everyone kept saying how generous it was. Daniel was over the moon. He spent nearly every waking moment on that PC, upgrading parts whenever he could. For years, it was his most prized possession. Then, about a year ago, things changed. Daniel started losing interest in gaming. He got into outdoor activities, hiking, camping, things like that. The PC sat untouched in his room, gathering dust. A few months ago, he told me he was planning to sell it. I told him the same thing anyone would. He could do whatever he wanted. It was his to sell. He ended up selling it to a college friend, Matt, for a solid price. Matt paid in full and took the PC home. Daniel and Matt are still friends, no bad blood or anything. It was a clean, fair sale. I didn't think about it again. Then last week, I got a call from my uncle, Daniel's father. The moment I answered, he went straight to the point. He wanted the PC back. At first, I was confused. I asked him why, since Daniel had already sold it. He said my youngest cousin, Lucas, who's 16 now, had his heart set on that PC. He claimed that because I originally bought it for the family, it should stay in the family. I told him that didn't make any sense. The PC belonged to Daniel. He had sold it. It was out of everyone's hands now, but my uncle wasn't having it. He got more aggressive, saying I had used family money to buy it. That was complete nonsense. It was my own salary. Then he pulled out the emotional manipulation. He started bringing up my grandfather, saying Grandpa always believed in keeping things within the family. I could see exactly what he was doing, but I didn't budge. I told him Daniel had made his decision, and that was the end of it. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. A couple of hours later, my parents called. They weren't as aggressive, but the pressure was obvious. They told me I should just fix the situation and get the PC back. I told them there was nothing to fix. Daniel sold it. It wasn't coming back. Then Daniel reached out. He sounded guilty, like he regretted selling it now that it was causing drama. He even said he would try talking to Matt and see if there was a way to get it back. I told him he didn't have to do that. He had every right to sell it. Meanwhile, Lucas, the cousin who wanted the PC, threw a tantrum. He started calling me selfish, saying I was stealing from family. I ignored it, but then my uncle called again. This time, his tone was different. He wasn't demanding anymore. He just said, "You'll regret this." And then he hung up. That was a week ago. I have no idea what he meant by that, but something tells me this isn't over. The drama didn't die down. If anything, it got worse. My uncle and aunt started posting vague, guilt-tripping messages in the family group chat about how selfishness is destroying the family and how some people forget where they came from. It didn't take a genius to figure out who they were talking about. A few relatives started chiming in, agreeing that family should always come first. I ignored it, but then my parents switched tactics. What started as just help fix this turned into full-blown accusations. They started telling me I was ungrateful for everything they had done for me, bringing up things from years ago, paying for a doctor's visit when I was younger, helping me move apartments once. It was all being thrown back at me now, as if I owed them something in return. Then my aunt, Lucas's mother, called. She was crying, saying I was ruining her son's happiness, that he had been looking forward to getting that PC. I reminded her that he had never owned it, that it had been Daniel's, and that Daniel had sold it. She kept saying, but he thought it would stay in the family. I ended the call before it could go in circles. Then Daniel called, and this time he sounded stressed. My uncle had threatened to cut him off financially if he didn't help resolve the situation. Since Daniel was still in college, losing that support would put him in a difficult position. He asked me if I could just let it go, for the sake of keeping the peace. I decided to give Matt a heads up. If my uncle was this obsessed, I wouldn't put it past him to try and convince Matt to sell the PC back. Matt laughed when I told him, and said he had no plans to get involved. The PC was his, and that was the end of it. Then Lucas started messaging me. He went from passive-aggressive to outright rude within minutes. He called me selfish, heartless, and said, brothers should look out for each other. I reminded him that we weren't brothers. He left me on read. The next day at work, I got a call from my mother. I didn't pick up the first few times, but she kept calling, so I finally answered. She immediately launched into a guilt trip, asking how I could treat my family this way. I had to hang up because my boss walked by, but she sent me texts right after, telling me I was embarrassing them. Then my father texted, "You'll regret being this defiant." That was it. No context, nothing, just a warning. By now I was getting passive-aggressive messages from distant relatives. My aunt and uncle had spread some story that I had taken the PC back out of spite, and now people were reaching out to tell me how disappointed they were. I blocked my uncle, aunt, and Lucas. The moment my parents found out, they were furious. Since they couldn't reach me directly, they started calling from different numbers, and even had other relatives contact me, demanding to know why I was cutting off family over something so petty. I told them I was done with the nonsense, and hung up. Then came the last straw. My parents invited me over for a casual dinner. I had a bad feeling about it, but I went anyway. The moment I walked in, I knew I had been set up. My uncle, aunt, and a few other relatives were there, all looking at me like they were waiting for an explanation. My uncle started saying how this had gone too far, and that I needed to buy the PC back from Matt. The others nodded, as if this was a reasonable request. I laughed, told them they were out of their minds, and walked right out the door. I don't know what they expected, but I made it clear I wasn't going to play their game. For a few days, everything went quiet. My parents stopped calling, my uncle and aunt weren't harassing me, and the group chat was silent. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like they were just waiting for me to cave in. Then Daniel reached out again. He told me he had offered Lucas some money instead, hoping it would be enough to make him drop the issue. Lucas refused. He didn't want just any money. He wanted that exact PC. No replacement, no other option. Not long after, Matt messaged me. Lucas had somehow gotten his number and had contacted him, demanding the PC back. According to Matt, it was a ridiculous exchange, with Lucas acting as if he was owed the PC. Matt blocked him immediately. Then my mother sent a message. It was short and to the point. If I did not fix this mess, I wouldn't be invited to family gatherings anymore. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it was clear she expected me to panic and give in. I didn't respond. That same night, Lucas posted online, making a vague complaint about certain people who pretend to care about family but abandon them when it matters. A few distant relatives started commenting, agreeing with him, even though none of them knew what was actually going on. Then, out of nowhere, I started getting messages from relatives I barely spoke to. It turns out Lucas had made new social media accounts and started contacting people through alternative profiles, trying to get his message through despite being blocked. It was obvious my uncle and aunt had been feeding them some twisted version of events. The next morning, my uncle sent me a long message insisting that I apologize for disrupting family harmony. I ignored it. A few hours later, I noticed my parents had blocked me. No warning, no last attempt at convincing me, just blocked. Then weeks later, they reached out again from new numbers, making it clear they only wanted to talk to demand that I cover Lucas's legal fees as an apology to the family. Daniel, meanwhile, finally had enough. He called my uncle and told him to stop blaming me for a gift I had given him 5 years ago. He made it clear that this had nothing to do with me, and that he had sold the PC because he didn't need it anymore. That should have been the end of it. But with no progress, my uncle and aunt changed tactics. This time, they suggested that I should buy a brand new PC for Lucas since it was my fault he didn't have one. That was it. I shut it down for good. No one was getting a PC from me, old or new. I made it clear to Daniel, to my remaining family members who still spoke to me, and to anyone else who might ask, I wasn't budging. Then family friends started chiming in. People who weren't even involved started messaging me, urging me to make peace and just find a way to smooth things over. Some of them even acted like I was being stubborn for not just buying Lucas a new PC. But then Daniel did something I didn't expect. He sent a message in the family chat, publicly stating that I had absolutely nothing to do with this, that it was his decision to sell the PC, and that everyone needed to stop blaming me. Lucas's response? He messaged Daniel privately and accused him of betraying the family. At this point, I had no idea how far they were willing to take this, but it was clear they weren't done. The lies escalated quickly. My aunt and uncle started spreading a new story, claiming that I had stolen a sentimental family heirloom. It wasn't just about a gaming PC anymore. They were twisting it into something much bigger, painting me as someone who had taken something that belonged to the family. At first, my parents seemed like they were going to stay out of it, but that didn't last. My mother started calling again, saying I was being cold-hearted, that I should just talk to Matt and fix this. When I ignored her calls, my father joined in, sending texts about how I was making things harder for everyone. Then Daniel called, and this time, he sounded stressed. My uncle had threatened to cut him off financially if he didn't help resolve the situation. Since Daniel was still in college, losing that support would put him in a difficult position. He asked me if I could just let it go, for the sake of keeping the peace. Meanwhile, Lucas took things public. He posted a dramatic video on TikTok, hinting at family betrayal without naming names. His friends flooded the comments, telling him he was right, that family should come first, that I should just give it back. Then my uncle and aunt started a poll in the family group chat, asking if I was being unreasonable. Many of the older relatives, who only had their side of the story, voted against me. More messages started coming in, telling me I was being selfish. But then something unexpected happened. My cousin David, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke up. He called out the entitlement, pointing out how ridiculous this entire situation had become. He told everyone they were bullying me over something that had nothing to do with me. For the first time, someone besides Daniel was openly on my side. Then my mother sent another message, this time suggesting a neutral meeting to talk things through like adults. I agreed, but only on the condition that both Daniel and Matt were there. The moment I arrived at the meeting, I knew it was going to be a disaster. Lucas was already fuming, pacing around, his arms crossed. As soon as I sat down, he exploded, shouting about how I was selfish, how family comes first, and how I should have never let an outsider keep the PC. Matt, completely unfazed, calmly said, I paid for it. It's mine. End of story. Then he turned to Lucas and asked why he was acting like a spoiled child. That shut him up for a second, but my uncle jumped in, trying a different approach. He started talking about all the things they had done for me, all the past family favors, trying to guilt trip me into giving in. Then my aunt took it a step further. She offered Matt double the price he had paid for the PC. Matt just laughed and refused. That's when my parents turned on me. My mother looked at me with disappointment, telling me I was ruining relationships and refusing to compromise. My father shook his head, saying I was being impossible. Daniel sat there, clearly regretting ever selling the PC in the first place. Lucas, still fuming, suddenly pointed at me and shouted that I would pay for this. Then he stormed out. Before leaving, Matt looked around the room and made one final statement. I will never sell this PC back, and if anyone tries anything, I will involve the police. Then he walked out. The meeting was over, but I knew this wasn't the end of it. A few days after the failed family meeting, Daniel called me in a panic. Lucas had shown up at Matt's dorm, trying to confront him in person. He kept lurking around the building late at night, and campus security eventually had to warn him to leave. Campus security had seen him lurking around the building on the surveillance cameras. He had waited until late at night, then tried to get inside Matt's room, but someone saw him and called security before he could do anything. They caught him red-handed. Matt wasted no time reporting it. Security checked the footage and confirmed Lucas had been hanging around the dorms multiple times that week, clearly looking for an opportunity. The situation escalated fast. My uncle and aunt went straight into damage control. They begged Matt not to press charges, claiming Lucas had just made a mistake. They said he was young, that he didn't mean any harm, that he had just let his emotions get the best of him. Matt wasn't having it. He told them he had evidence and wasn't going to ignore it. That's when my mother dragged me back into it. She called, telling me I needed to convince Matt to let it go, claiming that since I had started all this, I had a responsibility to clean up the mess. Meanwhile, Daniel was reaching his breaking point. He told me he couldn't handle the stress anymore, that he was seriously thinking about dropping out of college just to escape the family drama. He had been getting pressured non-stop. His parents telling him it was his fault, relatives calling him selfish for selling the PC in the first place, Lucas blaming him for everything. Then Lucas tried to excuse himself. When confronted, he claimed he just wanted to talk to Matt and had no intention of stealing the PC. No one believed him. If that was true, why was he sneaking around the dorms late at night? My uncle, still refusing to accept reality, gave Daniel an ultimatum: convince Matt to drop the complaint, or he would be cut off financially. But this time, Daniel didn't back down. He said he was done defending Lucas, that Lucas deserved whatever consequences came his way. Matt followed through with the police report. He officially filed it for attempted theft and trespassing. My aunt and uncle scrambled to spin the story. They told anyone who would listen that Lucas was the victim of a misunderstanding. They painted him as a kid who made one bad decision and was now being unfairly punished. But the truth was already out there. Then my parents turned on me again. They blamed me for ruining Lucas's future, acting like I had forced him to break into Matt's dorm. More distant relatives messaged me, repeating the same nonsense about how I should fix this. Lucas was suspended from high school for a week, while his behavior was investigated. His school took it seriously, especially since it involved security footage and a police report. Then, in a last desperate move, Lucas posted an angry video online, ranting about how family means nothing and how he was being treated unfairly. He claimed he was the real victim, that he had only ever wanted what was rightfully his. His friends flooded the comments agreeing with him. As if all of that wasn't enough, my aunt and uncle made one last demand. They told me to convince Matt to drop everything before it went too far. I refused. A few weeks later, Lucas was officially served a court summons for attempted break-in and trespassing. The reality of the situation finally hit my family, but instead of accepting responsibility, they scrambled to find a way out of it. My uncle and aunt became desperate, pleading with relatives to write character statements about how Lucas was a good kid who had simply made a mistake. They wanted to convince the court that this was all just a misunderstanding, that Lucas did not deserve legal consequences for his actions. Then my mother made one last attempt to guilt me into fixing things. She called, crying, saying I was tearing the family apart over a computer. She talked about how things would never be the same, how family gatherings would be ruined forever, how I had turned my back on them. Meanwhile, Matt had moved on. Despite all the drama, he was still going about his life. He occasionally messaged me to update me on any new family interference, but for the most part, he had put it behind him. Lucas, however, had not. Even after everything, he tried contacting Matt again. This time, he used a new account and messaged him, claiming he would make things right if Matt just gave back the PC. Matt ignored him. Daniel, exhausted from everything, reached out to Matt to apologize. He admitted he felt responsible for starting all of this by selling the PC in the first place. Matt reassured him that he did not blame him, but made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with our family anymore. Then the biggest consequence hit. Lucas was permanently expelled from school. The school had taken the situation seriously, and with the legal case moving forward, they decided to cut ties with him completely. My uncle and aunt immediately blamed me. They said I had ruined Lucas's education, that this would affect his future forever, and that I had an obligation to fix it. When I refused to respond, my parents finally gave up and blocked me. But then my uncle and aunt took it a step further. In what was possibly the most ridiculous demand yet, they insisted that I pay for Lucas's legal fees. Since I was the root cause of his downfall, it was apparently my responsibility to help him now. I laughed and ignored the demand. Daniel had reached his limit. He cut contact with most of our extended family, only keeping in touch with a few relatives who had not been involved in the drama. Lucas, in one last desperate act, posted another online rant, this time blaming me directly. He claimed I had destroyed his future and called me a traitor. Matt, not wanting any more involvement, completely cut ties with anything related to my family. With the legal case now moving forward, Lucas was facing real consequences. And as far as I was concerned, I was finally done with the entire mess. Lucas was officially charged with attempted break-in and trespassing. His parents, now realizing how serious the situation was, scrambled to hire a lawyer in a desperate attempt to fight the case. They still refused to acknowledge that Lucas had brought this on himself. Instead of taking responsibility, they focused all their energy on blaming everyone else. That started with me. My uncle and aunt began spreading the story that I had set Lucas up. They told relatives that this had been some elaborate scheme to ruin his life, claiming that if I had never involved Matt, none of this would have happened. It did not seem to matter that Lucas had broken the law all on his own. Somehow, I was the mastermind behind everything. Then, despite having gone no contact, my parents unblocked me. But it was not to make peace. They demanded that I cover Lucas's legal fees as an apology to the family. They acted as if it was my duty to fix the mess, as if I had forced Lucas to break into Matt's dorm room. I refused and blocked them permanently. Shortly after, Lucas was officially expelled from school due to the criminal charges. That only made things worse. My uncle and aunt were furious, claiming that I had ruined his future and that this was all my fault. The fact that their son had attempted to commit a crime did not seem to register with them. Matt, completely done with the drama, took extra precautions. He upgraded his dorm security and informed his school administrators about the situation. He wanted to make sure no one from my family would ever try anything again. Meanwhile, Daniel was still struggling. He told me he was considering transferring schools just to get away from the pressure. Even though he had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with the situation, our family continued dragging him into it. They blamed him for selling the PC in the first place, saying that none of this would have happened if he had just kept it. Then the guilt-tripping messages started. My uncle and aunt recruited distant relatives to pressure me, and I began receiving emails from family members I barely spoke to. Some of them told me to make things right. Others outright accused me of being responsible for everything that had gone wrong. Then Lucas tried to save face. He posted a half-hearted apology video online, but instead of taking responsibility, he blamed bad influences. He acted like he had just been caught up in the wrong crowd, pretending that what happened was not really his fault. But people weren't buying it. Even some of Lucas's own friends started distancing themselves. They had been defending him at first, but once they saw how far things had gone, they backed away. Then, in a move that was somehow even more ridiculous than everything else, my uncle and aunt tried to sue Matt. They claimed he had caused emotional distress and ruined Lucas's future. The lawsuit was immediately dismissed. There was no case. They had nothing to stand on. After that failed, my parents made one last attempt to shame me. They accused me of choosing an outsider over my own family, saying I had destroyed relationships and torn the family apart. I ignored them. Lucas, still refusing to accept reality, made another desperate move. He posted in a gaming forum, asking how to legally reclaim stolen property. People in the comments tore him apart, pointing out that what he was describing was not stolen property. It was something he had never owned in the first place. That was when Daniel finally reached his breaking point. Tired of the constant blame and pressure, he cut contact with our extended family completely. He wanted nothing to do with them anymore. With no other options left, and no way to get the PC back, my uncle and aunt finally went silent. For weeks I heard nothing from them. The chaos had finally died down. Lucas's parents made one last desperate attempt to escape the consequences. They tried to move Lucas out of state, hoping to delay or even avoid the legal case altogether, but the court stepped in and shut that plan down immediately. With the charges already in motion, Lucas was legally required to stay put. Meanwhile, Daniel finally followed through on what he had been planning for months. He transferred schools and moved to another state, completely cutting ties with our family. He had been worn down by the constant pressure and guilt-tripping, and he wanted nothing more to do with any of them. Matt, still taking every precaution, ensured his school had full documentation of everything that had happened. He wanted no surprises. The school had already been made aware of Lucas's actions, and now they had official records in case anything else happened. But my uncle and aunt weren't done. Since they couldn't run from the consequences, they did what they always did. They lied. They started spreading a new story, claiming that Matt had somehow entrapped Lucas just to get him into legal trouble. They told anyone who would listen that this was all some elaborate setup to ruin their son's future. Then my father tried one last time. He sent me an email, asking for a family mediation session. He made it seem like he wanted to repair things, but I had seen this pattern before. Mediation meant they wanted to pull me back in and pressure me to fix things. I ignored it. Then Lucas's conviction became official. He was found guilty of trespassing. He now had a criminal record that would follow him unless he could get it expunged in the future. There was no escaping it anymore. The fallout from all of this tore my family apart. My uncle and aunt, once so sure that everyone would support them, started fighting amongst themselves. My parents distanced themselves from them, no longer wanting to be associated with their mess. The relatives who had once taken their side had gone silent. Then, just when things seemed to finally be settling down, Matt received an anonymous message. It was from one of Lucas's remaining friends, warning him to watch his back. Matt immediately reported it, and his college took it seriously. They flagged the message and added it to the ongoing documentation of the situation. Lucas, now with no school, no gaming PC, and a criminal record, spiraled. He started ranting online again, this time going off about how he had been betrayed by everyone. He painted himself as the victim, blaming everyone except himself. Meanwhile, my uncle and aunt were in serious financial trouble. They had poured so much money into Lucas's legal fees that they were now struggling to keep up with their expenses. The reality of what they had done was finally hitting them. Then, in another blow to Lucas, his girlfriend dumped him. After everything that had happened, she had finally had enough. The entitlement, the drama, the obsession over a PC, it had all been too much for her. She wanted nothing to do with him anymore. At this point I was done. I went through my contacts and permanently blocked every single relative who had tried to guilt-trip me. I wanted zero contact with any of them. Then, in one last pathetic attempt, my parents sent me a final message. They accused me of destroying my own bloodline over a computer. I blocked them too. Then I got a message from Daniel. He had finally settled into his new school, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. He told me he had never been happier being away from the family. But just when I thought it was over, I heard something troubling. My uncle and aunt were planning one last move to get back at Matt and me. I had no idea what they were planning, but after everything they had done, I knew better than to underestimate them. My uncle and aunt made one final desperate attempt to appeal Lucas's conviction, hoping to overturn the trespassing charge and erase his record. It was denied immediately. The court had no reason to reconsider a case that had already been thoroughly reviewed. Lucas's criminal record was now permanent, unless he found a way to get it expunged in the future, which would take years. Lucas, of course, did not take this well. He went on another online meltdown, this time directly naming me, Matt, and Daniel. He accused us of conspiring against him, claiming that we had planned this entire thing to ruin his life. His rant was long, unhinged, and filled with blatant lies. But unlike before, his audience had shrunk. People were tired of the drama. Even the few friends who had defended him before had stopped responding. The extended family finally started backing off. After months of watching my uncle and aunt escalate the situation beyond reason, most of them distanced themselves completely. No one wanted to be associated with them anymore. The relatives who had been guilt-tripping me earlier were now silent. Daniel took it a step further. He changed his phone number and email, making sure no one from our family could ever contact him again. He had completely wiped them out of his life. Lucas, meanwhile, was stuck. With no school and a criminal record, he found himself unable to apply anywhere else. His expulsion followed him wherever he went, and no decent college wanted to take him in. His parents tried to find loopholes, contacting private institutions, but every attempt was met with rejection. Matt, not wanting to deal with any more interference, packed up and moved to another city. He changed his contact details and made sure only close friends had his new information. Despite this, somehow Lucas's friends managed to track him down through old social media connections and sent him anonymous messages, warning him to watch his back. With no one left on their side, my parents tried one last time to reach out. They attempted to frame it as a family reconciliation, but I knew better. This wasn't about making peace. It was about them having no allies left. I ignored them. The fallout had completely destroyed my uncle and aunt's reputation. They had once been respected in the extended family, seen as leaders who always had a say in family matters. Now no one listened to them. Their obsession with the PC scandal had left them isolated, with nothing but resentment to show for it. Lucas had no choice but to get a job. He had never worked a day in his life. But with no school and no future prospects, he was forced into the real world. It was either that or rely on his already struggling parents, who had spent most of their money on legal fees. I ensured that my no-contact stance was permanent. I blocked every possible way for my family to reach me, removed mutual contacts who could be used as messengers, and even changed my email to prevent any surprises. Daniel sent me one final message before disappearing from family matters entirely. He thanked me for standing firm, even when he had been unsure of what to do. He told me he was finally at peace, away from the toxicity that had defined his life for so long. Then Lucas made one last pathetic attempt. Using a fake number, he tried to reach me, saying I owed him for ruining his life. I blocked him instantly. Years passed, and I never once regretted how I handled everything. The situation had been ridiculous from the start, and standing my ground was the only way to break free from the cycle of manipulation. And despite all of this, through all the chaos, the threats, the lies, and the family drama, the original gaming PC remained exactly where it belonged, with Matt,